Good afternoon. I'm Bob Hauser, Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the APS's first virtual program. I'm glad that so many of you have joined us today. We're close to 200 already. Even in this virtual environment, excuse me, I want to acknowledge that the Society's home rests on the traditional lands of the Lenape people. They are still among us. We honor their community and those of other Native peoples through our collections, fellowships, research awards, and outreach activities. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin. Most of our nation's founders were members, and the APS had Thomas Jefferson as its president for 17 years. Like the Constitution, the presidency, the courts, and the Congress, it was an essential piece of the bedrock on which our new nation was founded almost 250 years ago. It remains so today. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1 million of research grants a year, primarily to the younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. The Society sustains an informed citizenry. We do that through our meetings, influencing the influencers, and other events like this one. Although our facilities are now physically closed, we remain committed to serving our mission of promoting useful knowledge through virtual programming, of which today's seminar is the first of many to come during this emergency. Please check our website, amphilsoc.org, both for our traditional offerings and for news of forthcoming events. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Patrick Spiro, librarian of the APS and director of the Library and Museum of the Society, who will talk about how we will run today's program and introduce our host. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome everybody. I'm thrilled to welcome everybody to our first virtual event. The screen you see behind me is the library's reading room, which is unfortunately closed at the moment, but I do hope it's usually filled with scholars and researchers who are making discoveries every day in our collections. And I hope that if you haven't visited us before, you will find a chance to learn more about us by visiting us in person. And if you have been to the APS before, that you will come as soon as we reopen, which we hope will be soon. Before we get to the program, I really want to thank all of the library and museum staff and all the staff who have shown such resiliency in the face of this crisis and also the challenges that it's posed to us. I'm happy to report that we have strengthened our digital infrastructure, and we have now made more material available online than ever before so that scholars can still access our materials 24/7 around the globe. And I especially want to thank the staff who have made this first virtual program possible. Kyle Roberts, who heads the Library and Museum Programming, Adrianna Link, the head of scholarly programs, and Bayard Miller, the head of digital scholarship and technology here, who have started to put together some really compelling virtual programs. This is our first event, but I also want to announce what we have in the works coming up. I'm happy to announce that next week on Wednesday, we're going to host another webinar like this one, in which we're going to talk about the yellow fever epidemic that affected Philadelphia in 1793. We've invited Billy Smith, who wrote a wonderful book on this episode, to join us to talk about that experience in Philadelphia's past. The week after that, we hope to organize a discussion around Tom Paine The library has an incredible collection of Thomas Paine material, and we are going to invite a new author to talk about Paine and his history during the Revolution. And after that, we want to host a seminar on the census, which is happening right now too. So as Bob said, please check out our website. We're going to be updating information, and you can find out how to tune in online by visiting our website, amphilsoc.org. Now today is our first virtual program, so I just want to take a couple of seconds to talk about how we hope to run this program. First off, the version of Zoom that we're using is their webinar version, which is different from the version of Zoom that you all may be becoming more familiar with. In the webinar version, everyone is automatically muted. We cannot hear you. So if your dog starts to bark, or the cat climbs up on the desk and meows, or the kids or your significant other start yelling in the kitchen, we cannot hear you. Don't worry about it. The way the program is going to work is that for 30 minutes, Adrianna, as our moderator, is going to convene a discussion among leading historians of science about the history of pandemics. And then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. And to use the question function on the panel, on your Zoom panel, you'll see an option to raise a hand or Q&A on the right. Please do not raise your hand. We are going to use the Q&A function for this seminar. And in that function, you can ask a question. It will go to the moderators, and we're going to ask as many questions as we can in the time that we have. I'm also happy to announce that we're recording this session, and we're going to put it on our YouTube channel. The APS's YouTube channel will host this discussion in a few days after we're able to get it online. And so if your question is not asked during the Q&A period, you can pose that question on the YouTube channel, and people will be able to respond to it there. So we want to give you as many opportunities to join this discussion as possible, even if you can't do it today. So with those logistics out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce Adrianna Link, our moderator and host. Adrianna is the head of scholarly programs at the APS Library. She received her PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 2016. She specializes in the history of science. She spent a year as a postdoc at Amherst College before joining the APS Library as the head of scholarly programs. And she's in the process of finishing her book titled Salvaging Humankind, Urgent Anthropology, and the Archival Imperative. And so Adrianna, take it away.
Thanks, Patrick, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you who are joining us today virtually from home. As you can see, I am also in my home. I don't have a fancy backdrop, but I hope that you won't hold that against me. I'm very pleased today to introduce our panelists who will be participating in this roundtable conversation on the history of pandemics. So I'm joined, and I'll maybe just ask each of our panelists to wave when I introduce you, since I can't point to you on our lovely stage in person. So first, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Jane E. Boyd, who is the historical curator for Spitz-Spread's Death, the Influenza Pandemic of 1918 to 19 in Philadelphia, which is a long-term exhibition at the Mütter Museum of the College of Physicians. Dr. Boyd is an independent curator, exhibit developer, museum consultant, and writer and editor. She's trained as an art historian at Bryn Mawr College and the University of Delaware, and brings a wide range of interdisciplinary knowledge to her work as a public historian, also specializing in the history of science, technology, and medicine. Also joining us today is Dr. Scott Gabriel Knowles. Scott, hello. Who is a historian of modern cities, technology, and public policy, and a professor in the history department at Drexel. His most recent book is The Disaster Experts, Mastering Risk in Modern America, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2011. He's also more recently the host and discussant of a really great recent webinar series called COVID Calls, which features daily discussions about the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. And last but not least, we have Dr. Graham Mooney. Hi, Graham. Who is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of the History of Medicine in the School of Medicine and the Department of Epidemiology in the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he teaches about the history of public health and disease in Great Britain and the United States. His 2015 book, Intrusive Interventions, Public Health, Domestic Space, and Infectious Disease Surveillance in England from 1840 to 1914, came out in 2015 from the University of Rochester Press, and examines interventions such as infectious disease notification, institutional and domestic isolation, disinfection, school closures, and contact tracing. Jane, Scott, Graham, thank you so much for joining us today. Great. So our participants will be muted when they're not speaking, and they're more well-versed in how this all works than I am. But I wanted to start today's conversation actually with Jane. So Jane, you've been working on this exhibition at the Mütter Museum, and as the curator of this exhibit that looks at the 1918 flu pandemic and Philadelphia's response in particular to the disease, you've probably spent a lot of time thinking about the social and historical impact of epidemics. So I wanted to ask you, what resonances are you seeing now between what you discovered in researching the 1918 flu and the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly as it pertains to Philadelphia?
Well, thanks, Adrianna, and everyone at the APS for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. The first thing I wanted to say is we all may have doctor in front of our names here today, but we are really not the kind of doctors you should be listening to in this time of great confusion and crisis. So please, nothing we say is to be construed as medical advice. I'm sure you can all realize that. And we really want you to be listening to, well, to us, of course, but also to health professionals, the people at the CDC, Dr. Anthony Fauci, your state and local public health officials for advice on how to cope in the day-to-day. That being said, we're also here to provide some historical perspective, seeing what we can find out from looking back at the past. So about the 1918-19 influenza pandemic, its 100th anniversary was quite recently, so there's been a lot more attention paid to it because of that. It was really one of the most devastating health events that the world has ever known. It killed at least 25 to 50 million people worldwide, maybe as many as 100 million. We probably will never know what the total death toll was. It killed more people more quickly than any disease before or since. And it was exacerbated by the mass movements of people during World War I. This happened at the very tail end of the war. So at the time, there were no vaccines, there were no antibiotics to use against pneumonia, which was the most common secondary infection, and that was actually the greatest killer, was the associated pneumonia. And Philadelphia was extremely hard hit. That's one of the reasons why we did that exhibition, was because among the largest major American cities, it had the highest death rate of any of those cities. So we wanted to take a look at that. Fortunately, we know a lot more now than we did then. Now we understand how viruses work. We can analyze their genomes. We can develop vaccines and use that information to fight the virus. And so our medical knowledge and treatments are much more advanced. But as we've seen with a novel virus like coronavirus, the same way that the 1918 version of the virus was novel at the time, a virus that's extremely virulent, that you can easily be plunged back into 1918 conditions with a shortage of hospital beds, a shortage of medical staff falling ill, shortages of equipment and materials, being only able to provide supportive care, not being able to actually stop the disease in its tracks or treat it very effectively, and sometimes not even supportive care. So reading the stories that have been coming out of places like Wuhan, China, and Bergamo, Italy, those epicenters, I really am seeing a lot of those kinds of parallels of systems being completely overwhelmed and being very, very hard to cope with that situation. And the stories that are coming out of some of the New York hospitals are also very similar. So 1918 might be most useful as an example of what happens when systems are overloaded, when systems fail. How do you cope with that?
Great, thanks so much, Jane. I mean, I think you're exactly right that, first of all, thank you to the doctors, to the nurses, to the people to our medical practitioners who are taking care of all of the people who are sick and all of us in this moment. They really are, the front lines here. And actually, this seems to be a good segue to Scott, as somebody who's thought a lot about responses and preparedness to different kinds of disasters and moments of crisis. You know, how did the different kinds of strategies and of disaster preparedness and responses to events that you've studied, like 9/11 or like Hurricane Katrina, how do you see that mapping on to things like COVID-19? I mean, in what ways are the responses to pandemics similar or different from other kinds of disasters?
Well, thank you, Adrianna, for the invitation, and to my colleagues here for joining this discussion. So, you know, this is a question, of course, that I think we've probably all been asked a lot in the last couple of weeks. What are the historical models we can look at here to give us some hope or to give us some guidance of steps that need to be taken? 1918 is certainly one of them. I mean, we're at a bit of a loss, though, I think, to a certain degree, to find truly national disasters. That is, disasters that strike every community in America simultaneously. You have to go to, I mean, the Civil War, maybe, the 1918 pandemic, the 1927 Mississippi River flood that affected, you know, all of Middle America, I guess you could say, or the Great Depression. Each of those has their limits, though, because they all took place before we had a really organized Cold War state. So I think that's, for me, where the historical parallels, where I start to look. And even though, you know, an atomic nuclear war didn't happen in the United States, there was certainly a lot of planning at that time that imagined scenarios like the one that we're dealing with now, where you would have a 50-state plus territorial response. And I think that's an important context here. So in a sense, we prepared for a national disaster that never came the way it did, but the way they imagined it. But there was some groundwork laid at that time around building up a civil defense structure and strategy that was in place by the end of the Cold War. And the history of the Federal Emergency Management Agency shows that linkage with that past history. And after September 11, we saw a sort of tightening of that, in some ways almost a return to a Cold War readiness regime, particularly in the Department of Homeland Security. And so, you know, your question of what kind of lessons can we learn, I think the most immediate lessons are ones that take us back to this moment of formation after September 11 that reinstated a very strong command and control idea of how disaster preparedness should work. If you look at the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services, they're differently organized, certainly, and Health and Human Services gives some precedence to medical expertise, whereas Homeland Security does not, but they're both sort of supposed to be structured, you know, with expertise coming out of Washington, a lot of command and control, a lot of surveillance, a lot of logistical capacity, a lot of coordination capacity. And I think we're seeing some of the flaws in that logic right now. And in fact, I think Katrina showed us in many ways that you can't prepare for a hurricane by preparing for a terrorist attack. And I think the same is true right now. We shouldn't be preparing for a pandemic by preparing for a terrorist attack or for a nuclear war. So I see those echoes across time here. Health and Human Services failed to discharge the mission that they should have done in January and February. And so now it's FEMA's turn. And we're seeing similar kinds of problems. I mean, my hat's off to the very hardworking people in that underfunded agency and in HHS too. I mean, most of the people, when I say HHS failed, I mean the leadership. I don't mean the people who are actually trying to carry out the difficult work at this time. But they're operating with a failed disaster preparedness state in America, and we need a complete rethink of that. So historical, I mean, this hurts me as a historian to say this to a certain degree. Historical parallels are valuable, but right now they're incomplete. We're into new territory. It's going to require innovation in government.
Graham, I think I'm going to turn to you now from a public health perspective. I mean, what is your reaction to what Scott's saying about infrastructure and preparedness and surveillance?
Oh. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yep.
Just on that point in particular, how we prepare and capacity, there's a really good correspondence, I think in the Lancet came out today by Sarah Dalglish, from a colleague at Johns Hopkins, who basically says how this pandemic has exposed the shortcomings of things like the Global Health Security Index, which was supposed to, give an indication of nation states' capacities for managing an outbreak like this, the kinds of disasters that Scott was mentioning. And the two nations that were atop of that index, ironically, were the United States and Great Britain. So there's no how you factor in political leadership into those security indexes is a moot point. So that's an important aspect. Another one, which in some senses goes back to the sorts of things Jane was mentioning, is that with the focus on pandemics, the historical parallels that Scott was looking at and Jane was thinking about 1918, we can invoke the plague, we can invoke 1918, we can invoke SARS to a certain extent. These are all very extreme events, and historians use epidemics in Charles Rosenberg's famous analysis as a sampling frame to understand society. And I'm not going to critique Charles Rosenberg in any way, but what we also have to do is look at the times outside of these pandemics to understand what the responses are during them. So a lot of the legislation that is put in place that we're used to seeing now, the kind of policing, if you like, the enforcement of regulation, the ability to tell people with the force of law that they can't send their kids to school, that they can't walk in more than groups of 3 or 4 on the street, and they can't congregate in public places. All this kind of legislation was put into place more often than not in non-epidemic times, or to manage diseases that were much more common than a frightening outbreak, say, of cholera or bubonic plague. They were there to manage things like scarlet fever, measles, diphtheria. And so we have to look at the non-pandemic periods as historians to understand what gets mobilized during a pandemic period. And one of the key things is that those sorts of legislative interventions were articulated through the language of freedom, in the sense that you were expected to adhere to certain kinds of behaviours during an outbreak of scarlet fever or diphtheria, in order to enable the rest of the community to go about its business. You weren't supposed to endanger the rest of the community. So these policies were sold through that kind of language, and it's the sort of language that constantly comes up during episodes like this, crises like this, where the plea to the greater good is always used as a lever for people to, as individuals, to take on certain responsibilities.
Great, thanks, Graham. That's really helpful. And actually, I want to continue this thread in talking more specifically about quarantine, which is something that I know you know a lot about. But that we're also sort of finding ourselves now in these self-imposed states of quarantine. And I think it's getting increasingly difficult now as the weather is getting nicer. People are beginning to feel a little cooped up in their houses. They're citing, this is an impingement upon my freedom. Why is quarantine such a difficult thing to maintain or to enforce? I mean, can you give us more discussion historically about some of the social, political, financial situations that may make this such a complicated concept?
Yeah, well, as most of the attendees to this webinar probably know, quarantine has a very long history. It was developed as a strategy in Italy during the global pandemic of bubonic plague, what we now know to be as bubonic plague, in the 14th century. And it's one of the unique thing about quarantine as it is developed and the difference between it and other policies is that it was a policy that sequestered ill people as well as people who weren't ill. So if you had so the way it was used originally would have been if you had a ship that was coming into a Mediterranean port, that had come from, on the trade routes from the Far East, as it was then. The whole that was, suspected of carrying disease in one form or another. The whole crew and passengers would be isolated either on board the ship or in a quarantine station. And so that was kind of different to, for example, a pest house that would have been present to maybe isolate lepers or people with disease, and it was located on the outskirts of towns. So the whole idea of quarantine is quite drastic in that sense, and that's one of the reasons why it has such a a negative connotation in the public mind. And I teach quarantine a lot, and sometimes to public health professionals. And one of the questions I always ask them is, why is quarantine seen as such a bad thing? And that they just immediately say, oh well, we call quarantine areas the sick shack, or it means that people have to have their freedom restricted, and it's really bad. So I always ask them, what other terms could you come up for quarantine to make it seem better in the public's imagination? And people need to go to work. They need to send the kids to school, or they'd like to. They need to go about their daily life. And so one of the lessons historically is that it's not just enough to say you've got to do this from an epidemiological perspective. You have to say, there are other social, cultural, and economic reasons why we all have to adhere to these kinds of self-quarantine regulations.
Scott or Jane, I would love to give you the opportunity to offer your thoughts on kind of the history of quarantine based on either your work, Scott, in thinking about it in the longer history of disasters and risk, or Jane specifically as it implies to the history of flu in Philadelphia. Maybe Jane, we'll go with you first.
Okay. I'll start. Philadelphia did not quarantine. It really just wasn't possible in such a large, overcrowded city. There were a couple of institutions, just a tiny handful of places that did quarantine, and those were places that were already sort of enclosed. Eastern State Penitentiary, the prison, and Girard College, which had gates that could be locked, and so they could keep people out. Bryn Mawr College out on the main line out in the suburbs of Philadelphia also quarantined, and that was a sort of a smaller institution, and so they could kind of control that. So it was really only these very sort of small, highly localized efforts at quarantine, which did seem to have some effects. The places that quarantined did have lower illness rates and lower death rates. Bryn Mawr didn't lose any students, for instance, and Eastern State only had a very few deaths. So it did have some limited applicability, but as we have experienced over the past couple of weeks, when you're quarantining something that's larger than a single campus or a single building, you run into all kinds of challenges.
So I'm learning a lot listening to Graham and Jane, and I would say in the history of the United States, quarantine and its inverse evacuation really have long been sort of lightning rods of governance, particularly because they throw into relief this sort of need for a trust in an expert. You need someone who's going to tell you that this very extreme measure you're going to take, either moving indoors or staying in your town, and slowing commerce, which Americans historically don't want to do, or slowing speech, which historically Americans don't want to do. That's a drastic measure. Likewise, we've seen with hurricane crisis managing. I mean, this is something that social scientists spend a lot of time studying. How do you give warning to people that's strong enough that they're willing to pack up their belongings and their pets and leave their homes? And again, it sort of throws into relief this sort of, I think, ongoing tension in American life about the strong feeling that people have that they're the best to decide how to protect themselves, their families, their communities, and their homes, and then the expert. And I don't have to explain to anyone here, Americans have a love-hate relationships historically with experts. I would throw one little historical case in here, which has been interesting to me. I've been going back, I spent my entire career basically bashing Cold War civil defense planning. And now I've found myself going back to this planning and trying to reimagine it, re-engage with it to see if there are things there we can use. Unfortunately, on quarantine and sheltering, it's a very mixed picture. Americans in general didn't take seriously the advice, sometimes command of the government to prepare shelter. Why? It was expensive. And a lot of people felt like if there was a nuclear attack, you know, why would they want to live through this period of shelter to come out to an uncertain reality? But there was, particularly around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it became a sort of fascination of the press to send people, like a family or two, into a shelter for 2 weeks and then be there when they came out and ask them, you know, how was it? Did you survive? Well, of course they survived. And this became a sort of fad of news culture around that time. But the later studies, many of which were secret studies that were done later in the Cold War, was that the best way to approach this would be not to have people shelter in individual homes, but to shelter in community shelters, in part because the socialization was really crucial to keeping people from having what were thought to be maybe really terrible psychological effects in the home. And so we've been told in this particular instance, shelter at home, don't shelter as a community. So again, we're sort of in new territory here where historical analogies in American history don't get us very far.
Great. I mean, actually, I think that this is an interesting point that you're making about how the current moment is leading you to rethink the conclusions that you've already made in your scholarship. And, you know, I think as historians, it's an interesting question to ask about, you know, how is this moment making us rethink our approach to history of science, technology, and medicine? What kinds of approaches, new methods, new questions do we need to ask, or will we ask, or could we ask in reaction to this current moment? And I know, Scott, that's one of the reasons that you started doing these COVID calls is as a way to engage new historical methods and kind of get a sense of what's going on now with a diverse set of experts. And I'm wondering, maybe we can have a conversation about this, about, you know, what are the new kinds of questions and approaches that historians of science, medicine, technology may ask, will ask, could ask about this moment? Jane, we'll start with you.
All right. Okay. Well, speaking about the flu specifically, what I found when we started to do research on this topic is that historians, more recent historians, the people who now are looking back at this event 100 years ago, really find that it's a challenge to do the sort of traditional, conventional history on an event that was both so radically compressed in time and at the same time was so very far-reaching. The 1918 pandemic has often been called a forgotten pandemic, but that's really not quite true, because at the time, immediately in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic in the 1920s, there were a lot of studies, a lot of medical studies, a lot of epidemiological studies, a lot of statistical studies trying to figure out exactly what happened and how it could be understood. But all of those kinds of specialist studies were sort of overshadowed by the very severe impact of World War I, by the military and political history and that kind of analysis. So interest in the pandemic started to revive in about the mid-1970s, but a lot of those histories were kind of local or regional histories. A lot of them were based on newspaper coverage of the time, maybe with some oral history mixed in. And a lot of those were about battling the enemy of the pandemic. So in the immediate circumstances, rather than examining the long-term effects or consequences. But more recently, historians in the past, say, maybe three decades or so, have started to use the pandemic as a lens for really examining medical attitudes at the time and looking at public health infrastructure, which turned out to be inadequate. And historical geographers have tackled the disease spread. They've used computer modeling and so forth. And there have been ambitious big data studies, for instance, in Chicago, they took census records and correlated them with the mortality statistics to find out how socioeconomic status affected mortality during the pandemic. So there has been a lot of activity recently in the historiography using a lot of sort of interdisciplinary approaches, but there's some areas that really haven't been examined thoroughly. For instance, what happened in colonial societies when sort of Western medicine came into conflict with traditional medicine and belief systems, and what was the religious response for the pandemic, and even the question of how World War I affected the pandemic spread and impact. That's still being debated. There's some people that said it didn't have much of an effect at all, others who say it did have a strong effect. So there's lots of questions that are still being examined. So really, I think we need to use kind of all the tools in the historian's toolbox and really be very flexible and very interdisciplinary when we're thinking about past diseases and when we start to become historians of this current moment. You know, historians are all about collecting data, seeing patterns, making inferences. So I think we need to cast a very wide net as we're trying to do this work.
I'm going to turn to Graham now. What kind of questions do you think are going to come out of a history of public health perspective in thinking about the long history of emerging in infectious disease, history of epidemics, pandemics? I mean, this is back to disease control, which is you know, how you and I met. So I will unmute you, and let you answer.
There's a few things. You know, the fact it's a pandemic, and this may be pretty obvious, but yeah, the role of global health, and I use that in inverted commas, you know, as a term that it's a fairly amorphous term, what global health actually is. But critics of global health have been, you know, talking about its deficiencies and its weaknesses and the problems with global health for a long time. And I don't mean just, you know, the problems, say, with the World Health Organization or the United Nations, also the role of, you know, big philanthropy, the Gates, the likes of the Gates Foundation and so on. And yeah, pointing to the notion of a techno fix, the role of vaccinations, the role of immunizations, you know, things that we can, you know, approach, you know, to as a cure or a prevention mechanism, when really what the focus should be is investment in primary care on the ground, so that the sorts of capacities that Jane was talking about that get overrun in these times, you know, you're giving, you know, you would give under-resourced places, you know, more capacity. So I think that's going to develop as a theme. That's going to provide a lot of food for historical thought, is how the international response works for that, and how it's kind of, it can be flipped on its head, in the sense that we're very used to thinking about, you know, the way in which knowledge and expertise goes from, you know, the more economically developed world to the lesser economic developed world, from global north to global south. And I think that is going to be questioned as well, given, you know, the way in which we've seen the responses in China, Singapore, Taiwan, and so on. So there's that, and I think that could also be paired with I would encourage the people attending to go away and have a look at Paul Richards' work on Ebola in the 2014-15 crisis, where he argues that a lot of the response in that context was very much through local knowledge, deeply ingrained social knowledge, that really wasn't helped by the kinds of information and practices and knowledge that was being put forward by the international agencies. So I think that role of the hybridity of Western and non-Western, global North and global South, is going to be an important aspect. And then finally, I think another aspect is that the way in which historians often look at responses to epidemics or infectious disease or pandemics is to say that they become a tool through which otherwise marginalized or vulnerable groups can be the focus of increased surveillance and intervention, such as Chinese immigrants in San Francisco during the bubonic plague, such as Russian Jews during the typhus epidemic in New York in 1894-95, such as African Americans and tuberculosis in basically any American city you want to name in the 20th century. So, you know, there's the ways in which that always plays out is always different depending on each of the epidemic and the pandemic. So we're going to be able to look at some of that and provide a critique of how the public health response gets used to sort of focus on particular groups. And one group that interests me at the moment is the homeless. Well, sorry, people experiencing homelessness. You know, calls for, you know, housing them, giving them a shelter and roof over the head, all of a sudden becomes very easy during a pandemic, whereas in other times it doesn't. So it might be that those incremental if we can solidify those incremental gains in our social welfare, that would be a sort of an interesting thing that historians are going to be able to analyse and look at.
Great. Well, we're quickly running out of time, and I want to make sure that I get in this one last question before we turn it over to the audience. So you know, Jane, one of the goals that you had in putting together Spitspread's Death was to help memorialize the nearly 18,000 people who died as a result of the 1918 flu pandemic. And I think as we've been continuing this conversation, we're recognizing how important that these individual experiences, these narratives, the wide range of experiences really are in getting the full picture of what's happening in the course of a disease. So maybe Scott, I'll start with you. I mean, how do you make sense of how personal accounts, the stories that you're getting from COVID calls, how do those experiences help make the cases and COVID-19 more visible, or help raise awareness in a way that the mortality rates and the charts and the maps and all of those things that those things alone can't really do?
Well, there's obviously a tension there, because right now we're all trying to take in a great volume of statistical information. And of course that's important. You know, again, talking about listening to experts, they're often communicating to us they're communicating deep science to us in ways that try to assume a passing familiarity with science, and that's important. But, you know, we had a discussion yesterday on the COVID calls with a group of scholars who focus on disasters in Italy, and they were talking about the situation in Italy. And we talked about the statistics, and we talked about, you know, hard facts. And then Luisa Cortesi talked about the fact that she believes in her town, the generation of elders above 75 is now gone. And that one phrase, to me, brought home the need to have narrative capacity in this moment and empathy in this moment. And I think that's a challenge, because often when we historians are sort of asked to weigh in on these kinds of issues and be relevant for current issues, we're asked for lessons learned, we're asked for very concise, concrete, you know, actionable policy items. But I think we have a lot actually to contribute in doing things like collecting oral history, collecting the kinds of, they're not ephemera, they're really important documents, and what Jane was talking about, that capture not just the statistics of a moment, but the fears and the dreads of a moment, and like Graham was saying, the biases and the hatreds of a particular moment that may be drawn out by a disaster. I think we have a responsibility, and of course we have the ability, the training to do that. I've also been advocating, and I hope people will pick this up, we shouldn't wait until this is over, whatever over is going to mean. And I reject the idea that disasters end in an easy way, but we shouldn't wait till this is over to begin a process of listening to survivors and memorialization, because the process of memorialization actually empowers victims and empowers survivors to weigh in as moral authorities when a disaster, usually we say, well, when the disaster is over, but this is a slow disaster playing out all around the world over a longer period of time. I think we can play an important role to amplifying those voices. You know, practices that sometimes people think are a little low tech, you know, like oral history or autoethnography or ethnographic practices, those are ones I think are really crucial right now. So I would just encourage all of us in our community and people we interact with to take those practices very seriously.
Great, thank you. We have a few questions coming in, so if you don't mind, I think I'm going to turn to our attendees, who are plentiful. Let's see if we've go to the top of the list here. Okay, so let's see. I realize we're looking at this as historians and not talking politics, but do you think that ideas of fake news have hurt the idea of policies being introduced for the greater good and thus increasing the idea of infringing on freedom? I don't know. Graham, what do you think?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure. I think I'd really like to hear Scott's take on this, because my feel is that it's not just about fake news. It's about trusting expertise and trusting knowledge. So if we take a slightly longer term look at this, let's have one example with climate science. How the role of expertise and the role of science has been challenged and contested, and depending on who's in power, listened to more or less. But what that means is there's an erosion of trust. We saw in the Brexit debates in Britain, something that I followed very closely, being British, this total debunking of expertise and knowledge around what the impact of Brexit is going to be. And then you see, after Boris Johnson spent 4 years debunking expertise, then standing at a podium with his two experts stood either side of him, telling him, "We've got to, we're all in this together. You've got to come with me and what the experts say is important." So it's not just about fake news; it's about the locus and standing and trust in experts, and that's always a contentious thing. But I think we'd do well to think about the long-term impacts of undermining scientific perspectives.
I think related to that is the issue of transparency. The experts themselves need to be as transparent, as clear, as authoritative as possible. We've seen what happens when that transparency is lacking and how people suffer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Scott, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I would just say that President Trump's fake news rallying cry notwithstanding, I'm very impressed with what the media is doing right now, and I think it's a signature difference between previous episodes, 1918 or during the Cold War. Press suppression, as much as President Trump or Boris Johnson would like to enact that, as much as they ran on that as part of their platform, literally, hasn't worked. And so, I think there's a lot to be learned about how people in the midst of a disaster improvise their trust networks, like how they will get information if they're not turning to major networks or, whoever they're listening to. And that can be shifting throughout the course of a disaster. But there's a lot of media there to meet the need. And I think there's a sort of quasi-media, like literally what you're facilitating here, Adrianna, also plays a role in that, because I know journalists look to events like this, or they look to expertise, they look to meso-level places where they can get expertise and find people to sort of do their reporting, particularly in the midst of a disaster. They don't have time to read all these books about the 1918 pandemic. So I'm impressed with the media, and I think we have a responsibility to interact with them as best we can.
Well, we have a question here about the media, speaking of. So this question says, it was mentioned about the use of community shelters. Could you comment on a comparison we have now with the use of social media to stay connected in a similar way? So this actually goes to a question that I had about, the way that the media is both helping and hurting us in dealing with this. I mean, can we maybe talk a little bit about the role of the media in communications, both as it's affecting us now and also how it's been used or how it was used in the past? Graham, you want to start us off?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sure Jane will be able to say more about censorship during the First World War and its role with the influenza pandemic, if people want. But I think, as a historian of the 19th century, that was a period when you began to get extensive systems of the collection of data to do with mortality and morbidity. That's not to say that collections of data and information didn't happen previously. We could go back to in the 17th century and the bills of mortality in London that were a weekly bill of mortality of all the deaths by cause. But certainly in the 19th century, you began to get a much more sophisticated approach to the collection of information about deaths. And it was used openly. They began to publish in the newspapers in places like New York, where I am, Baltimore, London, Paris, Berlin, the weekly deaths in the cities by cause, deaths in other cities, and it was transparently used. And it was actually the people who were putting this information out were saying, we want to use this to help inform our response and in order to quell panic. So excuse me, there's a huge amount of noise in the background. So that role of information is something that hasn't, that has a long tradition. So I mean, that's the one thing I would say.
Well, paradoxically, during the 1918 pandemic, that as much as there was censorship, federally imposed censorship on the newspapers, critiquing the government was actually a crime, and newspapers were heavily censored, all of this in the name of keeping up wartime morale. So the newspapers were reporting on the pandemic, but that news was very rarely on the front page. It was buried sort of inside the newspaper. And what we found was that they were to some extent reporting honestly as they could, but they were also trying to kind of turn the facts a little bit. One of my favorite headlines was deaths increase but cases decline, something like that, always trying to put a little spin on the terrible news. Of course, all of this was after the beginning of the pandemic. Where information transparency really could have helped was when the virus was first beginning to circulate in the city and doctors wanted to warn people against gathering in large groups, but the newspapers would not publish their warnings.
Great. Sorry, I'm juggling questions as I'm interacting with all of you. So there's a question actually about how social media is changing the game here a bit for historians. So, we've talked a little bit about newspapers and other print media. How does the fact that so much of this is happening online, happening on Twitter, happening on Facebook, happening on Zoom, change the way that historians are going to think about this pandemic? Maybe Scott, will have you go since you're perhaps doing this the most.
Well, I mean, I think one kind of obvious response to that is that one thing none of us were really trained for, which is to be relevant in the daily news cycle, is now upon us. And I think it's actually something that history graduate programs or any training for historians, I think it's something we need to take quite seriously, particularly with the attacks on the humanities and the social sciences and the popular culture, but also in funding for arts, for museums, and for history departments. We can show a relevance in the moment. And there are some historians out there and other social scientists and humanists who are in the moment getting perspective put out there. Kevin Cruz is a good example of this at Princeton University, whose Twitter threads have become sort of legendary, sometimes literally taking on elected officials in real time and showing them historical documents that undermine their position. So he's in the discussion, he's in the debate, and most of us are not trained to do that. So it's a skill set that we have to acquire. The other thing I would note is that I think there's a data overflow here, and we're going to really need a rethink about how we capture, even conversations like this, email, text messages, the various different digital communications, which I think we haven't thought enough systematically about how we capture those and archive those. There's a Trump Twitter archive. When the first time I saw that, I thought I dismissed it out of hand, and I can't tell you how many times now I've gone back in my own research and used the Trump Twitter archive, because it's important that we have that trove of information. I also think there's a structural need to address some older problems here that we've struggled with. Open access, digitization of primary documents, funding for libraries, funding for archives, funding for museums. If this doesn't show us the continued need for all of that, I don't know what does.
Jane or Graham?
No, I couldn't. All I can say is that my bookmark folder has, you know, the number of incidences in my bookmark folder has gone up a lot.
I have oh, go ahead, Jane.
I was just going to say, I'm been sort of amusing myself with wondering 100 years from now how people are going to be looking back at this crisis and sorting through all the information. I must have read hundreds, maybe thousands of newspaper articles, and there's that labor is always going to be necessary to sift through the enormous volume of materials. But I think we also need to look beyond, say, you know, Twitter. We think of Twitter as being this enormous influential presence, but it's really only a very small percentage of people who use the internet, who use Twitter. So we do need to keep these things in perspective and think about what's not being recorded during this time of crisis, and what will be the kinds of information and stories that will be more difficult to excavate as time goes on.
So here's a good question, I think, for this group, and that's how do we connect as historians of science, technology, and medicine to our own local communities during this pandemic? Scott, let's start with you.
How do we connect with our own local communities in the midst of the pandemic?
Yes.
In our role as historians, I don't know if we connect in any way other than we should be at this time as just concerned human beings. I mean, I think that's, you know, the best we can, taking care of our neighbors and giving support for health professionals who are, you know, going and risking their lives every day, and the people who are keeping our economy running in these difficult, dangerous times. You know, I think there are, as this goes on, as we find more of our traditional sites, local libraries, museums, archive spaces, most of us will continue with our teaching in a distance sense, but there's also K through 12 schools that are trying very rapidly to figure out how to get curriculum formed and provided. And then there's school districts like Philadelphia that don't have that capacity, that are trying to figure out how to get paper materials out to students. I haven't seen any organization along these lines, but I hope we will see it emerge, how historians can actually come together and provide materials for teachers in this particular moment. But I think also what you're doing right here with this webinar, which is to not say, well, we're going to wait this is over and then assess what happened, but is to actually dive right in and try to talk literally in this moment. Those are some of the things we can do.
If we have time, I'd also like to add that, you know, you meet communities where they are. Yeah, I think it's very tempting for us as scholars and experts in one particular area to want to teach. But, you know, there's a long history of big institutions, you know, giving information that either isn't needed, isn't culturally sensitive, and can actually harm people. So we have to take those histories of institutions and local education into account when we're offering our services. We want to be allies. We don't want to be people who pontificate from on high, because that's the way in which we do damage. So if you haven't engaged with the community before this crisis, don't suddenly start looking around saying, how do I engage with the community now? Because you need to be trained to do that in the same way that we need to be trained to do social media. Because quite often you can end up causing more harm than good when you do that. So that would be just my word of warning, is to take a social justice and anti-oppressive stance, rather than, you know, I'm coming from a place of privilege, I can automatically do something good.
Yeah, absolutely, that's wonderful. We need to listen as much, if not more, than we talk at this point.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, and that does seem a good note to close on. So for those of you who did not get to ask a question, we're going to see if we can follow up with our panel of experts to get answers to you. We'll work on that later on. For now, I'd like to remind you all that next Wednesday at 1 p.m., we'll be having another one of these webinars with Dr. Billy Smith, who will be talking about yellow fever in Philadelphia. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. Please take care of yourselves and take care of one another. Be well, and be especially nice to your medical providers, because they're the ones who are really, at the front lines right now. So please give a round of applause virtually to our panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for being here.